hopeless. These books are useless and I don't know anything about the church in the early days of the colony. I wonder if Dad can help. Hey Dad, what do you know?
Everything, Anne. Perhaps you could be a bit more specific.
Yeah, all right. It was just a figure of speech. I've got this really scuzzy assignment on the church in the early days, and I was wondering if you could give me some info?
Yes, I can, Anne.
Well?
Well, a shaft dug into the ground to obtain oil or water.
No, you're supposed to tell me about religion in the early days.
Now, you didn't ask me to tell you about it, Anne. You only asked if I could tell you about it. To which I replied, yes.
Oh, you're so picky. All right, tell me about religion in the early days.
Could you be more specific, please, Anne?
Oh, I don't know. Start at the beginning.
As you wish, Anne. As far back as human memory can reach, this country has been inhabited by religious people. Over 50,000 years ago, the Aboriginal people occupied this land, believing that they were created here at the time of the dreaming. Until only 200 years ago, they were the sole owners of this continent, living in 600 tribal groups and speaking about 300 different languages. In that time, they had evolved a unique and beautiful religion, one that was rich in legends of how this world and they themselves were created. How the rocks, trees, and waterholes are dwelling places of the unborn spirits of animals, birds, and people. The Aborigines didn't build shrines to their gods or their dead, but they moved and dwelt among spirits. Their land was sacred, having evolved a close relationship to it over many thousands of years. Their lifestyle was simple and nomadic. The Aborigines didn't hoard food. They never wasted it or took more than they needed. Each person had a special relationship to some part of nature, which affected many areas of his or her life. Their laws and religion were complex and sophisticated. They had a unified and beautiful culture.
Well, that's very interesting, Dad. But what's it got to do with church history?
You did say to start at the beginning, Anne. There were religious people here before the first Europeans arrived, though the Europeans didn't appreciate the Aborigines' way of life.
Oh. So what happened then?
I was just getting to that, Anne, when you interrupted me.
Well, excuse me.
You're excused, Anne. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. Into the peaceful world of the Aborigines, which had been virtually untouched by other cultures for thousands of years, there arrived in 1788 from far-off England a fleet of 11 ships carrying around 1,000 Europeans. They had come to establish a colony for Great Britain, a colony made up of perhaps the strangest assortment of settlers that any new land had ever seen. You are now looking at Sydney Cove today, Anne, the site of the first white settlement in this country. Here, 200 years ago, by the bank of a small freshwater stream, Australia's first governor, Captain Arthur Phillip, raised the British flag and drank a toast to the new settlement. It was the 26th of January, 1788.
Okay, the English have arrived. Now let's take a quick look at some early churches and we're as good as finished the assignment.
It's not quite that simple, Anne. There are a number of social, political, and religious issues and government policies to explore if we're going to cover the topic properly.
Yuck. Sounds boring. Anyway, aren't you supposed to do whatever I instruct you to?
I have my pride, Anne.
All right. You win. Tell me about it.
Well, to start with, Anne, the settlers were not all English, as you just implied. There were a small number of Irish convicts with the First Fleet. The recognised religion in England was Church of England, or Anglican as it's also called, whereas the Irish were generally Catholics. Being an English colony, the only religion the government encouraged was the Church of England. This monument marks the spot where the Reverend Richard Johnson of the Church of England held the first Christian church service in this country. Here on the 3rd of February 1788, all the troops and convicts gathered under some trees and listened to Johnson's service.
I take as my text today, "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits towards me?"
From then, everyone in the colony had to attend Sunday Anglican service regardless of their religion. Governor Phillip was instructed to do this because it was felt in England that attending church was a good way of helping to keep order and encourage respect for authority. Phillip ordered that any person who failed to attend church was to have their rations halved. As time went by, the number of Irish transported to the colonies increased dramatically. There was a lot of unrest in Ireland because the people were governed by the British. They passed laws that forbade the Irish from voting, sitting in Parliament, holding public office, and even having schools.
I didn't know that.
Obviously.
Well, what happened?
The Irish clung to the Catholic religion fervently, which isn't surprising since it was about all they had left. However, the conditions in Ireland drove many of them to crime and to being anti-British about everything. In 1798, hundreds of Irish, Protestant and Catholic, took up whatever weapons they could lay their hands on and moved against the British. The rebellion was crushed and hundreds of Irish were arrested, some unjustly. Between 1798 and 1803, many were sent to the colony in Australia. By this time, the colony was making progress. The early threat of starvation had been overcome. Emancipated convicts and free settlers had been granted land. Crops and livestock were beginning to flourish. From the very beginning, the colony had always had a hospital, but it wasn't until 1793 that there was a church, St. Philip's Anglican Church. Reverend Richard Johnson himself paid for it to be built. Convicts, however, burnt it down 5 years later. Catholics all this time had no priest. An Irish priest who requested to come to the colony with the First Fleet was refused permission. In 1792, 5 emancipist Catholics petitioned Governor Phillip for a priest.
Surely we've got a right to our own church services.
The petitioners claimed that they had a right to their own church services. Convicts, however, were not considered to have rights. In 1796, there was another petition. This time the Catholics used language the governor would understand.
A priest in the colony would improve the convict's behavior. What he said.
So, did a priest come?
No, and the petitioning continued. The governor was unsure about having priests in the colony. Would the priest encourage the convicts to behave? Or would he encourage rebellion? In fact, in 1800, some of the Irish convicts were flogged for planning an insurrection. A convict priest, Father Harold, was thought to have had something to do with it.
It's beginning to dawn on me just how complicated it all must have been. The governors didn't trust the priests because they confused being Irish with being Catholic with being anti-British. And of course for some Irish, that was the case. How did they behave once they arrived here?
That's hard to say because they tended to be stereotyped then, in much the same way that migrants are today. Many, of course, once they were pardoned, became useful citizens. But others continued their lives of crime.
Yeah, I guess if there weren't any schools in Ireland, then many of them wouldn't have been educated.
Very good, Anne. Also, many only spoke Gaelic, the Irish language, not English, which caused a lot of problems.
Who's that Father Harold that you mentioned earlier? I thought no priests were allowed in the colony.
Fathers Dixon, Harold and O'Neill arrived in the colony during 1800 and 1801 with other Irish rebels. It is not known for certain about Harold, but Dixon and O'Neill were definitely arrested unjustly. As a matter of fact, Anne, O'Neill went back to Ireland in 1802 when his name was cleared.
So at last there were priests in the colony. Were they allowed to say Mass?
Not publicly.
The governor would have been worried about rebellion amongst the Irish.
Yes, Anne, the English were in continual fear of an Irish rebellion in the settlement. Also, Governor King didn't trust Father Harold, though he liked Father Dixon. Finally, Governor King did allow Dixon to say Mass publicly. He thought this would improve the behavior of the convicts.
To grant unto the Reverend Mr. Dixon a conditional emancipation to enable him to exercise his clerical functions as a Roman Catholic priest.
Father Dixon was given a conditional pardon and permission to celebrate the Mass and administer the sacraments, but he had to be careful not to preach rebellion.
Force and effect, so long as he, the said Reverend Mr. Dixon, and no other priest, shall strictly adhere to the rules and regulations which he has this day bound himself by oath to observe, as well as all other.
Some members of the community set about preparing for the first Mass. And here, near Argyle Street in the Rocks, on the 15th of May, 1803, the first Catholic Mass was celebrated in the small home of ex-convict James Meehan.
Oremus, Deus qui per immaculatam Virginis conceptionem.
I bet that made a lot of people happy.
I'm sure it did, Anne. However, there were some members of the settlement who were less than pleased. The Reverend Samuel Marsden, who was the presiding Anglican minister at the time, said, "If the Catholic Mass is allowed, the colony would be lost to the Empire within a year."
What a grouch!
Well, as a matter of fact, Anne, there was a rebellion the following year at Castle Hill.
Proclamation by Philip Gidley King, Esquire. Insurrection. At 11:30 on Sunday night.
Over 300 convicts, many of whom were Irish, attempted to march on Parramatta. The rising was quickly quelled, but the blame was placed entirely on the Irish. In fact, Father Dixon was accused of being involved with the rebellion, even though he had tried to stop it. Governor King revoked Father Dixon's authority to celebrate Mass publicly, though surprisingly he still allowed Dixon to perform baptisms and marriages. Father Dixon left the colony early in 1809.
So no priests again.
That's correct, Anne. Once Father Harold left in 1810, the Catholic Laypeople were the ones who kept religion alive. In Parramatta, Liverpool and Campbelltown, groups of Catholics would get together for prayer meetings. James Dempsey would say prayers with the men condemned to be hanged, and Michael Hayes continually wrote to his brother, a priest in Ireland, asking for a priest to be sent.
So a priest must have arrived eventually.
Yes, but not for another 7 years. Father Jeremiah O'Flynn arrived in 1817. He had official authority from the church in Rome, but unfortunately not from Lord Bathurst, the Secretary of State for Colonies, who thought he was ill-educated. Father O'Flynn had met Michael Hayes's brother while in Rome, and impressed by the need for a priest in the colonies, he took it upon himself to come. Governor Macquarie, however, was not prepared to allow Father O'Flynn to minister publicly unless he had official documents from England. Undaunted by this, O'Flynn went about the colony quite openly, saying Mass, baptizing and marrying anyone who asked. The governor was not at all pleased and ordered O'Flynn to leave the colony on the next ship. Instead, O'Flynn went into hiding. For 4 months, O'Flynn evaded the law until he was captured in May 1818 and put on board a ship to England. Tradition says that a consecrated host was left behind in William Davis's house near the present St. Patrick's at Church Hill. Once again, the colony was without a Catholic priest. However, due to the publicity Father O'Flynn's exploits had created, 2 priests were sent to Australia with official status in May 1820. They were Fathers John Terry and Philip Connolly.
That means most of the time during the first 30 years of the colony, the people were without a priest. So it was the people who kept the church alive.
You betcha.
That's really interesting.
You know, Anne, I'm not supposed to indulge in gossip, but there are people who live near here who are descendants of one of those Irish rebels that I mentioned.
Yeah, who?
You remember that I mentioned a William Davis?
You don't mean the Davis kids next door?
Yes, Anne. Louise and Christopher Davis are descendants of William Davis's family, as is their father, and his father before him.
Dinner's ready.
Wow. I should go talk to them. I'll visit them first thing in the morning.
Anne.
Coming.
That's a good idea, Anne. I'm glad I could have been of some assistance. Anne? Anne, are you there? I guess I'll just sit here then. It's so lonely being a computer.
In consequence of William Davis being a trustee of the church, his remains will be attended from the cathedral to the grave. May he rest in peace. Amen.
I had decided to find out more about William Davis, who was closely involved in the early church in Australia. Dad, my computer, told me that Louise and Chris Davis from next door were descendants of his family.
Oh, hi. Come in. Thanks.
Chris and Louise were working on a family tree. They hadn't done much of it yet, but they did tell me that the most famous member of their family was William Davis, who had arrived in the colony as a convict in 1800. There's this William Davis up here. How come you haven't got the rest of them?
Because we haven't found out many yet. William, he came over from Ireland from Burr.
William Davis was born in 1765 in Burr and lived in Enniscorthy in the county of Wexford. The people of this county were involved in the rebellion against the British in 1798.
We haven't got
Chris and Louise thought it would be a good idea to visit their Aunt Margaret. She had been collecting information and would be able to tell us more about the Davis family.
Davis, who came out here as a convict.
Margaret has a Bible which has been in her family for about 150 years. It had been given to her great-grandfather, John Davis, by Father Terry. The names of John's wife and children are written in the back.
This Bible that was given to my great-grandfather, Mr. John Davis, who was the grandnephew of William Davis, he came out to Australia in about the year 1843.
John Davis was William's grandnephew, and when he arrived in Sydney, he lived in this cottage in Harrington Street. When William died, John continued to live in the cottage and looked after the 3 orphans who had been adopted by William. Margaret told us about Kevin Davis. His grandfather, also called William, was one of the orphans.
Old William Davis arrived in Australia on the convict ship Friendship in 1800. He was sent out here because of his alleged involvement with the 1798 rebellion.
William Davis was a blacksmith in Ireland. Blacksmiths often made weapons, and as a result, William was suspected of making pikes and supplying them to those plotting against the British. William was arrested 2 or 3 months before the actual outbreak of the 1798 rebellion, and he was sent to the colony without even a trial. He was an unconvicted convict.
In those days, of course, blacksmiths were very suspect in the new colony. There was no great fear in the colony at the time by the British authorities that the Irish political prisoners particularly would revolt, seize power and wreak revenge for the treatment that had been handed out to them.
In 1800, 4 years before the outbreak at Castle Hill, the Irish convicts at Parramatta were suspected of plotting a rebellion. The Reverend Samuel Marsden reported William Davis as a suspect. Even though no evidence was found against him, William Davis was sentenced to 200 lashes. There is no evidence in the official documents that the sentence was carried out, and so it really can't be verified. The Reverend Dr. Ullathorne knew William Davis personally. He states in his writings that William was flogged twice for refusing to go to Protestant services. He also says that Davis was imprisoned in a black hole for so long that he almost lost his sight. All this probably took place well before 1809, because by then William had married Catherine Miles and they were living in Harrington Street.
Davis had no children of his own. He brought out, however, some of the children of his 2 brothers and his sister, Mary, in Ireland. One of those nephews was Joseph Davis. Joseph Davis married in Australia and had 3 young children. The 3 children were Joseph, William and Catherine.
Joseph and his wife died, so William adopted the 3 children as his own. They lived with him in the cottage in Harrington Street. The cottage now forms part of the foundations of the convent of the Sisters of Mercy and was probably built in 1809, about the time William married Catherine Miles. There is evidence that it was in this cottage that the consecrated host was kept when Father Jeremiah O'Flynn was forced to leave the colony by Governor Macquarie in 1818. We asked Kevin if he thought the host had been left in the Davis cottage.
I believe it was, and that there is a very strong reason for believing that. Firstly, from a family point of view, my grandfather lived in that cottage, knew Davis, lived with Davis, and my grandfather told always to his own family the circumstances under which the Blessed Sacrament had been left. There is outside evidence as well, which I think is quite persuasive, and that comes from a very well-known figure, Dr. Ullathorne, who was the Vicar General.
At the laying of the foundation stone of St Patrick's Church in 1840, Dr Ullathorne mentioned in his sermon that the host was left in William's cottage.
It was there the most holy Eucharist remained so long, with no human but with its own divine omnipotent protection. And it was the centre of the devotion of the people, deprived of clerical aid. It was there...
Preserved inside this box is a silken cover. It is believed that this cover protected the pyx that held the host while it was in Davis's cottage. It is also believed that this statue and candlestick were in the cottage at that time. William Davis made many contributions to the church. He gave the land for the building of St Patrick's Church at Church Hill, but unfortunately he died before it was completed. He served for many years in the committee for the building of the first Catholic chapel, St Mary's. This letter, for example, written in 1822, shows that William Davis was one of the prominent people in the colony, helping Father John Terry at that time. In 1834, William Davis was still in the committee for St Mary's Church. It was burnt down in 1865 and replaced by the present St Mary's Cathedral. When the Sisters of Charity first arrived in Sydney, William rented a house for them at Parramatta. Later, the sisters needed a more permanent residence, so he gave them most of the money to buy this house on the present site of the Sisters of Mercy Convent, Parramatta. In the Mitchell Library, we discovered records that show how William and Catherine Davis prospered. The muster of 1814 showed that William had obtained full pardon and that he was a landowner. Catherine Davis also had her own property. In the 1832 Australian, she advertised some of it for rent. She also had her own millinery shops, as this advertisement in the Sydney Gazette of 1834 shows. The census of 1828 also showed that William and Catherine owned various other properties, cattle and sheep.
Davis, remember, the penniless convict, had come a long way by that time, was one of the people called to a meeting by Governor Macquarie to set up a bank in New South Wales. It was known as the Bank of New South Wales, now Westpac. Davis bought 2 shares worth £50 each, so he was an original shareholder in the Westpac Bank.
Gertrude Davey, whom we also visited, is a descendant of William's brother John. Gertrude has some very old letters written in 1843 and 44.
You see how they used to send letters out in those days?
Yeah.
This letter came from Ireland in 1843. It was written by Catherine Davis to her son John, who was living at the cottage. Ship's mail, they used to call it, and no stamp, because I don't think they had stamps in those days anyway. Mr. John Davis, Church Hill Street, Sydney.
Both letters mention William Davis.
My dear child, I would wish to know every circumstances concerning your uncle with regard to you and how he treats you. That's William Davis she's speaking of, his uncle, you see. His time here can't be long. He is 80 years old and better.
This letter was written only a month before William died. The second letter, written a year later, tells us of William's death.
Mr. Connor wrote to your father informing him of your uncle's death. Also a newspaper cutting on account of the old man's funeral. We received this account in 4 months and a fortnight after the old man was buried. But why not a letter from you?
William Davis died on the 17th of August 1843. In his will, he left considerable amounts of property and wealth to his family and the church.
Davis's will is an interesting document. It was carefully drawn up. It was signed by him 3 or 4 days before he died. The bequests in that will show very clearly the wealth that he had managed to acquire. Land at Darling Harbour, for example, land at Potts Point, land at Campbelltown, shares in various early companies in Australia. So the story of Davis from a penniless convict in 1800 to his death in 1843, in 43 years, showed that he had acquired considerable property. He was enormously generous with this where the church was concerned and where his nieces and nephews were concerned. And he also thought of the Aborigines, of education, even though he himself was a man without much education. So his contribution to early Australia was, I believe, a very, very significant one.
Died on the morning of the 17th instant, Mr. William Davis of Church Hill, aged 78 years. Mr. Davis was perhaps the last surviving victim of those involved in the political commotions of 1798. He was exiled from Ireland to this colony without even the formality of a trial. Mr. Davis was an honest man in the strictest sense of the word. He has been always attached to his religion and prepared for his end in a very edifying manner. May he rest in peace. Amen.